Riley Thomas hadn't planned on starting over this way. He didn't believe in reinvention as some sort of romantic cleanse or grand declaration. For him, it was simpler and heavier than that. He needed quiet. He needed a place where things made sense, where lines drawn on maps meant something, where agreements held, and where no one was entitled to more than what they legally owned. That kind of order was hard to come by lately. After years of living downtown surrounded by noise that seeped into the walls and stress that never left his shoulders, Riley found himself saying yes to something unfamiliar. It wasn't a permanent change, at least not yet. He was leasing a modest waterfront property from an old friend who had gone abroad for a year and was considering selling the place once he returned. Riley was given the option to purchase it at the end of the lease, should he decide it suited him. And right now, that potential, having the right to make something his on his own terms, felt like the only form of peace worth pursuing. The house sat at the edge of a pine-lined bluff overlooking a lake that barely made the maps. It wasn't the type of place tourists found, and that was its charm. The yard sloped gently toward a narrow footpath leading to a private dock that had seen better days but still stood with quiet dignity. There were no loud boat parties here, no traffic, no unsolicited flyers or streetlights buzzing overhead. The nights were full of silence, broken only by crickets and the occasional creak of wood expanding in the cool air. Riley worked from home, teaching philosophy courses through a university extension program. His days began with coffee and reading, and the sound of wind through the trees became the new background noise for grading student papers and answering emails. The home was rustic but well-maintained, with just enough personality to feel lived in, and just enough wear to remind you that nothing stayed perfect for long. That suited him just fine. He didn't meet Karen Brady until the third morning. She approached from the right, walking the narrow gravel shoulder that ran along the edge of her property, which bordered his to the west. She wore a thick sweater despite the mild weather, and carried herself with the kind of assertive self-possession that people confuse for politeness, but which always masks calculation. Riley had been trimming low-hanging branches near the old path to the dock when he heard footsteps approaching. He turned to find her smiling, not the warm, neighborly kind, but the curated one you see in real estate brochures or dental offices. She introduced herself as Karen, emphasized that she'd been living in the area for decades, and that her family had been a part of the community since before the bylaws were even written. She didn't say what bylaws or why that mattered, but Riley noted the tone. It wasn't a conversation, it was a subtle claim. She talked about the lake like it belonged to her, reminiscing about how her father used to fish from the west side drop, which, as she motioned with her hand, happened to include Riley's dock. She asked about his plans for the place, whether he was just renting or planning to make this home. Her phrasing was careful, disarming, yet embedded with challenge. Riley kept his response neutral but firm. He had a lease with purchase rights and was settling in. She nodded, pursing her lips, and said she hoped things worked out for him, adding that the dock had always been a bit of a gray area. Riley had been warned in vague terms that the neighborhood could be territorial, but he hadn't expected the boundaries to be up for debate. Still, he let it go. People like to stake mental claims to things, especially in quiet places where drama was rare and history long. It didn't mean anything, he thought. Yet. Over the next week, Karen reappeared frequently. Sometimes she was walking her dog, other times carrying a notebook or talking loudly on her phone as she paced the edge of her property. Riley would glance up from whatever he was doing and find her there, standing just past the shrubs, looking toward the dock with a narrowed gaze and lips slightly parted as if perpetually on the verge of saying something. One afternoon, she stopped him while he was unloading groceries and offered him a pie. The gesture seemed friendly, if somewhat forced, but the conversation that followed made its purpose clear. She asked again about his intentions with the land, whether he knew that technically there had once been a shared access path from her lot to the water. Riley smiled politely and told her that nothing of the sort was reflected in his lease, nor in the county records he had reviewed before moving in. Her eyes narrowed briefly before softening. "It's just a shame to see history forgotten," she said, then added, "But I suppose we all have to make room for newcomers." From that point on, her tone shifted. Gone were the neighborly check-ins. Instead, she became distant but ever-present. She never trespassed outright, but her presence was always felt. The sound of her dog barking toward Riley's property line became a daily routine. At one point, he noticed that small flags had been placed in the grass along the edge of his path. Bright orange markers commonly used by surveyors, but none had been there before. He hadn't ordered any work, and when he asked the utility companies, none of them had flagged his area. It wasn't conclusive, but it was telling. He removed them quietly. Then came the odd conversations with other neighbors. A man walking his bike past the property stopped to ask Riley if he was renovating the shoreline, something Karen had apparently mentioned. Another neighbor dropped off mail mistakenly left in her box and offhandedly asked whether Riley knew about the disagreement over water rights on this side. Each time, it was nothing, just a comment, an assumption, but taken together it formed a pattern. Riley didn't say much. He had no interest in starting a feud with someone he barely knew, but he wasn't naive. He had dealt with people who operated this way before, passive, persistent, and convinced of their own entitlement. He reviewed his documents again. Everything was clean: the lease, the survey, the municipal records. He kept digital and physical copies backed up in multiple locations. It was better to be prepared. The final moment that sealed the shift from uneasy tension to quiet alarm came on a quiet Sunday evening. Riley had been reading on the back deck as the sun set. The air was still, and the water below reflected the last pink light of the day. He heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, moving along the gravel path by the water's edge. When he looked up, Karen was standing at the tree line just outside the edge of his lot, staring not at him, but at the dock. She didn't wave. She didn't call out. She just stood there, watching, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. After a long pause, she turned and walked back the way she came, disappearing into the fading twilight. Riley didn't sleep well that night, not because he was scared, nothing had happened, technically, but because he knew something had shifted. This wasn't just a neighbor with a strong sense of nostalgia. This was someone who saw boundaries as suggestions and history as leverage. Someone who didn't need permission, only justification. And Riley knew the difference. It began, as many things of consequence do, without announcement or drama, just a shift in routine, a detail out of place. Riley had taken to walking down to the dock each morning after breakfast, a ritual as natural as brushing his teeth. On that particular morning, the gravel underfoot felt strange, more uneven than usual, and as he reached the final bend in the path, he stopped short. The wooden steps leading to the dock were gone. Not dismantled, not damaged. Gone, as if someone had lifted them clean off their frame and carried them away. In their place were jagged bolts and two short planks nailed hastily across the support beams, like a crude barricade or an afterthought of construction. Riley stared at the scene for a long moment, not angry, not confused, just calculating. He hadn't authorized any work, and there had been no sign of damage the day before. The bolts weren't rusted or worn. This had been done recently, maybe even overnight. He turned back and walked up the slope toward the house, pulling out his phone as he went. There was no point in guessing. He needed to record everything. He took photos from multiple angles, checked the timestamps, then opened the county's maintenance request portal to verify that no scheduled work had been logged. Nothing. No permit activity, no reports of hazard. The dock, as far as all official channels were concerned, hadn't been touched. That left one explanation, and it didn't require much imagination. He opened his saved contacts, found the number for the property owner currently abroad, and left a voice message attaching the photos. Then he sat on the porch and waited. His call wouldn't be returned until late that evening due to the time zone difference, but when it was, the answer was clear. No one had authorized anything. No maintenance, no inspections, no dock removal. The property owner hadn't spoken to anyone local, and certainly not to Karen Brady. The next morning, Riley filed a vandalism report with the sheriff's office. He didn't expect much to come from it, but he wanted the paper trail. An officer came out in the afternoon, took notes, and snapped a few photos of his own. The man was polite but impassive. When Riley mentioned his neighbor by name, the officer nodded slowly and said only, "We're familiar." Nothing accusatory, nothing direct. Just familiar. It was enough to confirm that Karen's behavior wasn't entirely new. Riley asked whether cameras or motion detectors would help. The officer gave a non-committal shrug. "Can't hurt," he said, and with that, the visit was over. Riley took his advice. That same week, he ordered a pair of discreet trail cameras with night vision, the kind hunters used, and placed them strategically. one facing the slope leading to the dock, the other covering the narrow pathway behind the tool shed. 2 days later, the flags returned. This time, they weren't orange but bright red, planted in a tight line from the edge of Karen's property across Riley's side yard, stopping just short of the dock foundation. The implication was unmistakable. Someone, presumably Karen, was staking a claim. Riley didn't touch them this time. Instead, he walked the line, took high-resolution photos, then opened the parcel map overlay from the county assessor's website. His property line was clearly marked. The flags weren't on the edge. They were over it. That same afternoon, he scheduled a visit from a licensed surveyor. If Karen wanted to start a boundary dispute, she would have to do so with someone who understood the legal weight of precision. In the meantime, Riley kept to himself. He didn't approach her, didn't knock on her door, didn't leave notes or make accusations. He didn't have to. She knew what she'd done, and he wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of rising to it. But Karen had no intention of de-escalating. She didn't need Riley to respond. Her actions were aimed at making his life feel unstable, unsure. Like nothing on his property was truly his. One morning, Riley awoke to find a new set of for sale signs staked along the roadside. Not on his lot, but close enough to make passers-by assume they belonged to him. Each one bore the name of a realty firm he'd never heard of, and a phone number that went to voicemail. When he called, pretending to inquire about the listing, a clipped professional voice confirmed that a parcel near the lake was under evaluation, pending clarification of certain boundary claims. Riley made note of the call, saved the number, and immediately contacted the firm listed on his lease agreement. The representative confirmed there had been no authorized listing activity and advised him to send a cease and desist request to the number provided. It was all just vague enough to avoid being technically illegal, but pointed enough to serve as psychological warfare. Then came the letter. Not from a law firm, not on legal letterhead, but on heavy cream stationery with embossed initials. KB. It was hand-delivered, slipped between the slats of his porch door. The contents were brief, 3 sentences, written in tight, elegant script. This dock was shared for over 30 years before newcomers began claiming it as their own. My family has never signed away access rights, and I have no intention of allowing misinformation to stand uncorrected. Please be prepared to discuss alternatives before legal channels become necessary. Riley read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in a plastic sleeve. He scanned it and sent it to his attorney, a no-nonsense woman named Laura Mendel, whom he had retained months earlier to review the lease. She responded within an hour, advising him not to engage directly, to document everything, and to begin preparations for a formal civil response in the event of further provocation. Don't assume she's bluffing, Laura wrote. Some people build their entire identity around imaginary entitlements. They'll go bankrupt trying to defend them. Riley took the warning to heart. He had the dock steps repaired carefully with photographs and contractor invoices. He printed laminated signs and posted them at the start of the path. Private access, authorized use only. He walked the boundary every evening, checking for new flags, disturbances, or footprints. The cameras he'd installed proved useful, capturing Karen on 2 separate occasions entering his lot uninvited. Once to remove the signs, once to inspect the foundation near the shoreline with a flashlight in hand. Both instances were submitted to the sheriff's department, and Laura filed a petition for a temporary protective order, citing repeated trespassing and harassment. Karen didn't stop. She began making loud phone calls within earshot of Riley's yard, referencing false claims, property theft, and legal fraud. She stood for hours by the water's edge, arms crossed, lips pursed, watching. Riley said nothing, but the tension grew. It wasn't the kind you could ignore or pretend was accidental. It had a pulse. It had weight. And it was moving forward. The real shift came when Riley received a knock on his door from a man in a sport coat, carrying a clipboard and a badge. Not a police officer, a private mediator from a dispute resolution board. Karen had filed a claim alleging adverse possession interference and had requested third-party negotiation. It was a pre-litigation tactic, one that rarely led to court but often laid the groundwork for it. Riley accepted the documents and set a meeting with Laura the same day. They would attend the mediation. They would present the lease, the maps, the survey, and every photo. and they would make it clear that this was not going to be settled with compromise. His land was his. The law was on his side, but Karen wasn't relying on law. She was relying on erosion of boundaries, of patience, of resolve. She wasn't just challenging a map. She was challenging the idea that someone like Riley, a quiet man with no history in the area, no generational roots, no local alliances, had the right to take up space and draw lines that excluded her. That, more than anything else, was the real battle forming beneath the surface. And Riley was done pretending it wasn't. He wasn't scared. He was ready. The mediation session was held in a rented conference room at the back of a suburban law office, the kind of place decorated in muted greens and framed motivational prints that promised peace through compromise. Riley arrived with his lawyer, Laura Mendel, precisely 10 minutes early. They'd laid out their documents neatly. Copies of the lease agreement, surveyor maps, time-stamped photographs of boundary flags and dock removal, and the printed correspondence from Karen, including the handwritten letter she had so confidently delivered weeks before. The mediator, a man named Clarence with soft features and an excessively calm voice, welcomed them and explained the process. He stressed neutrality, reminded them this was not a courtroom, and that the goal was to reach a mutual understanding. Riley listened carefully, not interrupting, not reacting. He didn't need to win over Clarence. He only needed to establish that this wasn't a dispute. It was harassment thinly veiled as a misunderstanding. Karen arrived 7 minutes late, alone, wearing a dark gray blouse and a fixed smile that suggested this was just another tedious obligation. She didn't greet Riley. She greeted the mediator with a warm handshake and immediately launched into a rehearsed monologue about generational oversight, land transition errors, and restorative access. Her words were carefully chosen, dipped in diplomacy but laced with subtle disdain. She spoke of her family's history in the region, of how her late father maintained the dock before any current paperwork had been filed, and of how the recent lease had obviously created confusion. Her tone suggested that Riley was a well-meaning outsider who had been misled by legal formality. When it was Riley's turn, he simply presented his documentation and kept his statements brief. Laura supplemented with legal clarification, making it clear that not only did Karen have no current claim to the property, but any historical assumptions had long since been extinguished under state law. The mediator nodded frequently but said little. The session ended without resolution. Karen declined to acknowledge the photos showing her on Riley's land, brushed aside the flag placement as markers for a personal garden layout, and questioned the accuracy of the survey, even suggesting that Riley's lease might be based on outdated plotting. It was the kind of claim that sounded serious but had no backing. When Clarence suggested a cooling-off period and possible second meeting, Karen declined. "It's best if we let formal channels clarify things," she said smoothly. "I've already reached out for legal review." With that, she stood, thanked Clarence, and left. No eye contact, no farewell. Over the next 2 weeks, the silence was louder than before. Karen didn't approach Riley's property or make any direct contact, but her absence felt strategic rather than passive. It was the calm before something, and Riley felt it in his bones. On the 15th day after mediation, he woke to find his front gate open, and one of the wooden garden boxes near the path completely destroyed. Not simply toppled, but shattered, as if struck with force. The soil had been scattered across the gravel, and the small rosemary and thyme plants he'd been nurturing were gone, roots and all. He checked the trail cameras. One had been disabled, its batteries removed. The second captured a blurry figure in a hooded sweatshirt, moving low to the ground around 2:18 a.m. just beyond the box. The footage wasn't clear enough to identify the person, but it was enough to file another report. This time, the responding officer was different. A younger deputy named Reed, who listened closely and didn't brush off the concerns. He asked about the prior complaints, took notes on the destroyed planter, and reviewed the footage. "This isn't random," he said quietly. "And she's escalating." Riley didn't reply. He was already making a mental list, what to reinforce, what to back up, what to document again. He spent the next day replacing the gate lock, installing motion-activated floodlights, and switching the camera batteries to hardwired connections. He sent the updated footage and officer's report to Laura, who responded within the hour with a proposal. It was time to pursue a restraining order. They would file based on a pattern of behavior: trespassing, property damage, harassment, and build the case accordingly. That same evening, as Riley sat on the back porch watching the floodlights flicker to life one by one, he heard something that didn't belong. It wasn't loud, a soft crunch like gravel underfoot, followed by the subtle shift of air as someone passed too close. He stood quietly, turned off the porch light, and waited. No movement, no sound. He stepped inside, locked the door, and checked the live feed. The rear camera caught a figure walking along the edge of the fence, flashlight in hand, slowly tracing the property line. Karen. The beam of her light swung methodically, stopping every few feet as if checking for something. She wasn't just wandering, she was measuring, confirming, looking for something to use. Riley recorded the footage and saved it to a cloud folder marked legal. 2 days later, he received an envelope via certified mail. Inside was a notice. Karen had filed a civil complaint in county court, asserting long-standing usage rights to a portion of the property, citing an obscure clause related to implied easement due to historic access. The claim was weak, almost laughably so, but it triggered a mandatory appearance and response. Laura called immediately after reviewing the paperwork. "This isn't about winning," she said. "She's trying to bury you in procedure. She wants to make owning your space so exhausting that you give up." Riley didn't give up. He doubled down. He hired an independent title attorney to review the property's chain of ownership, traced back 3 decades. He requested aerial photos from the county archives showing the development of the dock and surrounding landscape, establishing its sole use by prior owners with no overlapping history. He submitted a motion to dismiss the claim based on lack of standing, attaching video photographs, affidavits from prior owners, and an updated survey confirming 0 easement. Meanwhile, Karen intensified her psychological tactics. At night, she left lights on facing Riley's property, illuminating the path like a prison yard. Wind chimes made of steel utensils clattered through the night. Twice, packages meant for Riley were found ripped open and discarded near her fence. When delivery drivers were asked, they said they left the parcels at the correct address. He filed every instance. He kept the logs. He recorded audio, video, dates, names. Then came the dog. Riley returned from a short grocery run to find a large black Labrador sitting on his back deck, collarless, watching him with unsettling calm. It wasn't aggressive, but it didn't leave. It just sat. When Riley approached, it stood, walked around the side of the house, and lay down by the flagstone garden. Karen's side. A few hours later, it was gone. The next morning, Riley found deep scratches on the door and a torn corner of his outdoor furniture. The implication was clear. Nothing was safe. Nothing was out of reach. The escalation no longer felt like territorial behavior. It had become something else. A campaign not to reclaim land, but to break a person. The paperwork, the lights, the visits, the silence. It was all architecture. A constructed chaos meant to displace Riley psychologically. But she had miscalculated one thing. Riley didn't value the land for nostalgia or investment. He valued it because it was his, because it was earned, and because he wasn't going to let someone like Karen rewrite reality with whispers and flags and shadows. The final straw came a week later. It was dusk. Riley stepped outside to retrieve a fallen branch near the path when he heard the sharp click of a trigger behind him. He turned slowly and saw Karen, standing no more than 10 feet away, a revolver in her hand, aimed downward but unmistakable in intent. Her voice was calm, almost bored. "This can't go on," she said. "You're pushing too far. That dock isn't yours. You need to go." Riley didn't speak. He didn't move. He let the silence stretch until she shifted, just slightly, waiting for reaction. Then he said evenly, "You've just made your last mistake." He walked backward, hands visible, and entered the house. Locked the doors, called the police. Within minutes, 2 units arrived. Karen didn't resist. She stood calmly, arms folded, the gun now holstered but surrendered. She said little, but her eyes never left Riley as she was escorted away. The arrest was clean. The charge, brandishing a weapon in a threatening manner, was backed by testimony, video, and weeks of evidence. It was no longer a boundary dispute. It was criminal. And Riley knew, even as the cruiser disappeared down the dark road, that this wasn't just victory. It was the beginning of the reckoning. Karen's arrest didn't bring immediate relief. There was no victorious silence, no sudden lightness in the air, no celebratory moment to mark a turning point. If anything, the stillness that followed was heavier. Riley had spent weeks preparing for escalation, for games of intimidation and procedural traps. But the sight of her with a gun had shifted the playing field into something more primal, more dangerous. The incident had turned the situation from a neighborhood dispute into a matter of criminal liability. The law at last was no longer indifferent to Karen's behavior. And yet, Riley knew better than to believe the fight was over. The responding officers had been thorough, professional. They took statements, secured the weapon, and reviewed the footage from Riley's security camera, which clearly showed Karen approaching his property with a drawn firearm. The video captured the tone of her voice, steady and detached, her words spoken with conviction, not hysteria. There was no ambiguity, the report was filed and charges were recommended, but Karen made bail within hours. By the next morning, she was home. That fact alone reminded Riley that legal systems moved slowly and that proximity didn't disappear with an arrest. Laura Mendel called him early the next day. Her voice was sharper than usual, less measured. She was angry, quietly but deeply. "She'll try to flip the narrative," she warned. "People like her never admit fault. She'll say she was afraid, that you provoked her. We have the video, the records, the history. That matters. But be prepared for the story to twist." Riley didn't ask what he should do. He already knew. Stay the course. Document everything. Assume nothing. By midweek, court dates had been set. One for the criminal charge and another for a restraining order, which Laura had refiled immediately after the arrest. Karen responded with her own legal maneuver, a countersuit claiming harassment, defamation, and emotional distress. It was poorly constructed and lacked evidence, but it served its purpose. It forced Riley to continue playing defense, to show up, to engage. And that, he suspected, was all she needed to feel in control. In the meantime, the atmosphere in the neighborhood began to shift. Riley noticed fewer casual waves from passing cars. A couple of neighbors who had previously been friendly now crossed the street instead of walking past his property. Conversations that used to linger now ended abruptly. He wasn't surprised. Karen had deep roots in the area. People didn't need to believe her version completely. They only needed to feel uncomfortable enough to stay uninvolved. That's how isolation worked. It didn't require confrontation, just absence. One evening, after a particularly long meeting with Laura and an insurance adjuster, Karen had begun claiming damages to her property caused by vibrations from Riley's outdoor lighting system. He received a knock on the door. It wasn't the police or a process server, just a woman he vaguely recognized from a few houses down. She introduced herself, said her name was Natalie, and hesitated before speaking further. "I just wanted to say," she began, voice low, "I don't know everything that's going on, but she's done this before. Not exactly like this, but similar things. With the Makins. With the couple who had that vintage trailer." Riley didn't press. He let her speak. She said Karen had once filed a noise complaint against neighbors who hosted a weekly book club. Another time, she called zoning enforcement about a chicken coop that had been approved 2 years prior. "She plays the long game," Natalie added. "She wears people down. One family just left. No fight. Just packed up and sold." It wasn't new information, not exactly, but it validated a growing sense Riley had been trying to push aside, that Karen didn't just act out of grievance. She operated from a place of engineered hostility. She used process as a weapon, turning bureaucracy into siege warfare. And it wasn't about winning in court. It was about exhausting the opponent so completely that retreat felt like relief. Riley wasn't retreating. He worked with Laura to finalize affidavits from the property owner and the previous owners, establishing an unbroken chain of private access to the dock, with no history of shared usage by Karen or her family. He requested an official review of Karen's weapon license, noting her behavior during the incident and the subsequent filings. The police took the suggestion seriously. Her license was suspended pending the outcome of the criminal case. It was a small victory, one that wouldn't stop her, but that placed a legal restraint on what she could carry. But what Karen lost in legal power, she attempted to reclaim in social leverage. Riley began receiving anonymous complaints, emails sent to his work address about unprofessional conduct, voicemails to his university's department line questioning his stability, references to behavior unbecoming of an educator. They were vague, unsubstantiated, and impossible to trace definitively, but the timing was no coincidence. Laura advised him to preemptively file a workplace incident report, documenting the campaign of harassment. His department chair, thankfully, was understanding. Still, the feeling lingered that Karen had reached into his professional life, and that nothing, not even his job, was outside her line of fire. And yet, amid the pressure, something shifted inside Riley. It wasn't anger. That had passed. Nor was it fear. That had calcified into something harder. It was resolve. Not the righteous, cinematic kind, but the quiet decision a person makes when they realize the only way forward is through. He stopped checking the cameras obsessively. He stopped jumping at every knock. He understood now that the battle was no longer about a dock, or a line in the dirt, or even a woman with a gun. It was about the story Karen told herself, that her presence in the neighborhood gave her dominion, that time and tenure and boldness were enough to unmake contracts and erase maps. Riley decided he would prove her wrong not by fighting her methods, but by outlasting them, by staying, by living, by continuing his work, watering his plants, rebuilding the garden box, and walking the path to the dock each morning. He wasn't there to claim space. He was there to keep it. Not because he had something to prove, but because someone had decided he didn't belong. And that was the one thing he could never accept. The midpoint came not with a bang or a confrontation, but with a quiet morning. Mist on the water, coffee in hand, the repaired steps beneath his feet as he sat on the dock and listened to the world go on. Karen's house stood silent in the distance. The tension had not disappeared, but he no longer felt its weight in his lungs. He had built a wall around his mind that she could not climb. The war wasn't over. But for the first time, Riley knew he could win it. The weeks that followed brought no peace. Only the illusion of quiet layered over a deeper tension that moved like a current beneath the surface. Karen's physical presence diminished, but the sense of her hadn't gone anywhere. If anything, her absence was strategic, calculated. Riley understood that silence didn't mean surrender, especially not from someone who had shown such methodical persistence. He had seen this tactic before in different forms, not in legal battles, but in academic disputes, in subtle bureaucratic warfare where people didn't yell or break things, but instead filed, documented, delayed, and manipulated until their opponent no longer recognized the ground they stood on. Karen was drawing from the same playbook. She wasn't retreating, she was repositioning. The official restraining order hearing had gone forward, and the judge had granted it without hesitation. The footage of her with the weapon, the detailed log of events, the multiple reports to law enforcement, all of it painted a picture too coherent to ignore. Karen was prohibited from approaching Riley's home, his property, or contacting him directly or indirectly. For a moment, there was a sense that maybe this line at least would hold. But Riley had learned better than to trust in court orders as shields. They were pieces of paper, and Karen didn't strike him as someone who feared paper. It started again with the land. This time, not flags or whispers, but a formal notice pinned to a post just outside his gate. An official-looking letter from a third-party surveying firm notifying him that, pending a boundary inquiry initiated by a neighboring property owner, their agents would be on site within the week to conduct a non-invasive review of topographical markers. It was worded with precision, the kind that made it seem legitimate but left enough ambiguity to raise alarm. Riley sent it to Laura, who tracked the firm and found that it wasn't fraudulent, but also wasn't authorized to act on his land. They had been hired indirectly through a regional land use consultant. Notably, Karen's name appeared in the original application, masked behind a management company. It was legal maneuvering at its slipperiest, not criminal, but harassing. Another layer. Riley posted a formal notice on his property. No entry without consent. He notified the county office that he did not authorize any boundary review, and made clear that any third-party presence would be considered trespassing. The day the surveyors arrived, they stayed just beyond his boundary, measuring with laser tools from the road and recording quietly. Karen stood across the street watching them, her arms folded, her expression unreadable. She said nothing. She didn't need to. The message had already been delivered. That week, his mail began to arrive damaged. Envelopes torn open, some contents missing, others soaked through as if dropped deliberately. Packages were misdelivered or simply vanished. His internet cut out twice without explanation. The provider, when contacted, said there had been unexpected disruption due to utility pole servicing. The same pole, he later learned, had been reported as unstable by a neighbor whose name wasn't listed on the maintenance log. Karen had found ways to invade the infrastructure of his day, not by breaking things, but by introducing irregularity, small disruptions that stole time and frayed nerves. One evening, as he pulled into his driveway after running errands, he saw something glinting near the back gate. He approached cautiously and found shards of broken glass spread across the entry path, the kind you'd get from smashing a heavy bottle. It wasn't random trash. The glass had been arranged to catch his tires or feet if he hadn't noticed. He swept it up, photographed it, and filed another report. The responding officer took his statement, but offered little comfort. "She's skirting the edge," he said. "Careful not to cross it." Riley knew that already. The broken glass wasn't meant to injure, it was meant to unnerve. Karen's campaign had become psychological attrition disguised as coincidence. Laura advised filing for a civil harassment suit in parallel to the criminal case already in motion. It was time, she said, to create multiple lanes of accountability. Riley agreed, though he didn't relish the thought of another courtroom. More filings, more hearings. He felt like he had a second job now, managing his own defense against a neighbor's delusions. But he committed to it. The case was filed with a detailed timeline and every piece of documented harassment from the start. Meanwhile, he invested in more security, remote camera access, pressure sensors along the fence line, and a backup generator after a suspicious short left him without power one night. Then came the letter, hand-delivered but unsigned, placed carefully in a waterproof sleeve and tucked into the fold of his deck railing. It was typed, plain, emotionless. A list of demands: remove all unauthorized equipment from the southern edge of the property, cease any visual monitoring that might infringe on adjacent privacy, and relinquish control of any historic pathways predating current ownership. The final line was chilling in its phrasing. "You were not meant to last here. That is not a threat. That is a prediction." He read it twice, then forwarded it to Laura and the police. It was the closest Karen had come to crossing the legal threshold again, and though her name wasn't on the letter, its content aligned so perfectly with her patterns that no one doubted its source. Riley responded not with confrontation, but with precision. He had a professional statement drafted, notarized, and filed with the county, reaffirming his legal rights, lease terms, and pending ownership. He sent copies to his insurance provider, the sheriff's office, and Laura. He began compiling a comprehensive portfolio titled Incidents and Interference, a meticulous record designed not just for defense, but for public presentation if ever necessary. Karen had tried to bury him in paper. He would out-document her. And then, just when the storm seemed to stabilize, Karen escalated again, this time by proxy. A vehicle Riley didn't recognize, a dull red pickup with no plates, began appearing near his driveway at random hours, sometimes idling for 5 minutes, sometimes longer. Once the driver got out, lit a cigarette, and leaned on the gatepost, staring toward the house. He never approached, never spoke. When Riley called it in, the vehicle was always gone by the time a cruiser arrived. He installed another camera facing the road. The footage showed the man clearly. Late 40s, average build, wearing a baseball cap, never looking directly at the lens. The police logged it, but with no plate, no confrontation, they had nothing actionable. Riley had begun sleeping with a heavy flashlight on the nightstand and his phone on silent but within reach. He wasn't afraid in the panicked sense. It was more calculated now, an acceptance that he was the subject of someone else's obsession. Karen had turned her proximity into pressure, her access into tactics. Her need to reclaim a part of the world that no longer belonged to her had morphed into a siege, not just on his land, but on his peace, his autonomy. But Riley didn't break. He adjusted. He fortified. He made noise in the right channels. He submitted requests to the court for formal discovery, forcing Karen to produce any evidence she claimed to have about land rights. She produced none. He subpoenaed phone records that placed her at the edge of his property during incidents she denied. He brought in a forensic technician to authenticate the audio from the gun incident. Every stone she threw he collected and stacked into a wall she couldn't scale. And through it all, he remained. Not out of pride, not even out of anger anymore, but because someone had tried to make him leave without justification, and that to him was intolerable. Riley had no desire to dominate anyone. He only wanted what was his, and the right to live on his own terms. That Karen had mistaken that for weakness was her most fatal miscalculation. The second escalation didn't feel like a battle. It felt like an attempted drowning, quiet and constant. But Riley had learned how to breathe underwater. The courtroom was colder than expected, not from temperature but from the air of controlled tension that seemed to hum just beneath the surface. Riley sat at the plaintiff's table, hands folded, documents aligned with perfect precision before him. Not out of nervousness, but as an act of discipline, of containment. The months of surveillance, reporting, hearings, motions, and quiet resolve had led to this moment. It wasn't triumph he felt, nor anticipation. It was clarity. The line Karen had crossed wasn't merely legal, it was moral, psychological. She hadn't just tried to take land, she had tried to unravel a person, and Riley was here to ensure that every thread she'd pulled would now tighten around her own narrative until it collapsed. Karen entered the courtroom with deliberate poise, her attorney at her side, her hair styled perfectly, her blouse the kind of crisp white that looked both modest and purposeful. She carried herself like a person misunderstood, a woman who had been pushed to the brink by some unfairness the world had yet to recognize. Her eyes didn't meet Riley's, not once. That, in itself, was telling. It was a tactic of reframing, pretend the target of her months-long campaign of erosion didn't exist, so that she might present herself as the only wounded party. The judge, a woman with a reputation for being surgically fair, entered with quiet authority. She had reviewed the files beforehand, over 400 pages of documentation, video evidence, law enforcement statements, restraining order violations, and sworn testimony. This was no longer a case of conflicting neighbors or unclear boundary lines. This was criminal court, and the charge, brandishing a firearm in a threatening manner, stood at the center of it all, anchored by a single truth that no argument could twist. Karen had approached Riley with a gun, spoken clear words of implied threat, and had been recorded doing so. Her defense team attempted what was predictable but tactically sound. They argued emotional distress, past trauma, a misunderstanding of proximity and intention. Her attorney painted Riley as an aloof, uncommunicative tenant who had refused to engage in good faith and who had provoked paranoia by installing invasive surveillance and reacting aggressively to what he termed encroachment. They acknowledged the weapon but claimed it had not been raised or pointed and had only been carried as a habitual safety precaution. Karen, when called to the stand, was calm, tearless, but measured. She recounted how, over the years, the land had felt like part of her, how watching it fall into unfamiliar hands had triggered a sense of loss that clouded judgment. When it was Riley's turn, he didn't posture, he didn't dramatize. He recounted the sequence of events as he had lived them, factually, chronologically, supported by digital records, police reports, and video stills. When the footage of the incident was played in court, the room fell silent. Karen's voice rang out over the speakers. "You're pushing too far. That dock isn't yours. You need to go." The tone was even, almost clinical, and the image of her standing with the gun, just 10 feet from Riley, frozen in a single frame on the monitor, became the pivot point around which the entire case now turned. Laura Mendel followed with a presentation as sharp as it was methodical. She broke down Karen's behavior into patterns: the property interference, the use of third parties to provoke, the legal manipulation, the psychological pressure. She didn't attack Karen as a person. She dissected her actions as a strategy of erosion, one that escalated when boundaries held and culminated in a direct act of intimidation. The judge listened without interruption, her face impassive but focused. When the defense attempted to challenge the admissibility of the written threats and the footage of Karen's silent surveillance on the property line, the judge overruled with a single sentence. "The pattern is consistent and the evidence cumulative." Closing arguments followed, subdued and professional, the legal equivalent of tightening the final knot on an already sealed bag. Then the judge recessed. Riley sat still, his breath slow, not thinking of outcomes but of aftermaths, of what silence would feel like once it returned to the space Karen had occupied with her fixation. When the judge returned, her verdict was immediate and clear. Karen Brady was found guilty of brandishing a weapon in a threatening manner, a misdemeanor in this jurisdiction, but one with weight and consequence when linked to a pattern of harassment. The restraining order was made permanent, her firearm license was officially revoked, and she was sentenced to 1 year of probation, mandatory counseling, and a fine substantial enough to sting. Furthermore, the court ordered full reimbursement for legal fees incurred by Riley related to the civil components of the case. Karen didn't speak when the judgment was read. She didn't cry, didn't shout. She simply stared straight ahead, her posture stiffening as if some invisible scaffolding around her identity had begun to crack, and she was bracing against the collapse. Her attorney spoke briefly with her, whispered something about options and appeals, but even that felt hollow. The room emptied quickly after, quiet as if the building itself had exhaled. Outside the courthouse, the air was heavy with summer heat. Riley didn't linger. He shook Laura's hand, thanked her sincerely, and walked to his car without a backward glance. It wasn't vindication he felt, it was exhaustion. But beneath that was something cleaner. Peace, not in the cinematic sense, but in the private one. Karen had been stopped. Not destroyed, not humiliated, but held accountable. And that was enough. He returned home to a property that now felt resolute rather than embattled. The trees swayed with the same rhythm. The dock creaked in the breeze, and the wind no longer carried the sense of watching eyes. There were still things to repair, both in the soil and in himself. Traces of strain, of vigilance learned too well. But he would tend to them with the same steadiness he had shown throughout. Not as defense, but as maintenance. He wasn't rebuilding. He was continuing. That, to him, was the real victory. Riley didn't mark the day Karen moved out. He didn't wait by the window or track the comings and goings of the movers or glance toward the thinning outline of her porch as each piece of furniture was wheeled away. He didn't need to. Her departure wasn't a spectacle. It was a slow, quiet withdrawal, like fog lifting from ground that had long since dried beneath it. Word traveled softly around the neighborhood. She had sold the house to a distant cousin or a trust or maybe a development group, depending on who was talking. And by the end of the week, her name no longer appeared on the local property database. There was no note, no final message, no apology, just absence. And in that space where presence had once pressed like a weight against his daily life, there was now air. It was unfamiliar at first. Riley caught himself pausing at the door before stepping out, scanning the edges of his property as if waiting for a sign, a sound, a ripple in the stillness. But none came. The silence held. For the first time in months, it wasn't loaded with anticipation. It was simply quiet. The yard had changed. Not dramatically, not in ways that would strike an outsider, but to Riley's eyes, every inch spoke of history. He could trace the edges of every tension that had built there. Each stake pulled from the earth, each disturbed line of gravel, each camera adjusted slightly to better capture a blind spot. And yet the land no longer felt embattled. It felt honest. Not untouched, but unshaken. He resumed his walks to the dock without thinking, without looking over his shoulder. The dock itself, rebuilt and weathering into the same gray hue as the shoreline rocks, had become a kind of monument. Not to conflict, but to endurance. It stood not because it had to, but because it had been defended with purpose. Riley sat there often, not out of ritual, but out of choice. Sometimes he read. Sometimes he simply listened. The water had a way of holding sound that felt like memory, but softer. Neighbors began to return, not all, but some. Natalie came by with a pie she said was just because, though her eyes held a quiet apology that didn't need words. Another man from 2 streets over waved one morning and called out that he'd heard everything worked out. Riley didn't correct the phrase. He let people define closure how they needed. He didn't require validation. What mattered was that he was still here, still upright, still his. The property sale moved forward smoothly, and when the final deed was recorded in his name, it arrived not with fanfare, but in a plain envelope. Riley opened it alone at the kitchen table, looked at the official stamp, the sealed signature, and allowed himself a rare smile. Not wide, not gloating, just real. The document was more than proof of ownership. It was evidence that reality had not been overwritten, that truth had held. The cameras stayed. Not all of them, but enough. Not as paranoia, but as memory. A few were turned inward, toward the garden he'd begun to rebuild. The soil he tilled now not with anxiety, but with calm intention. He planted new herbs, reconstructed the broken box, rerouted the path near the fence, Not because he feared more intrusion, but because it was his now and he could choose. Control was never about dominion. It was about being allowed to care for something without it being threatened. That was what had been tested. That was what had survived. One evening, as the sun fell low behind the ridge and painted the lake in molten amber, Riley took a flat river stone and walked to the base of the dock. There, where the path split slightly between the trees, he knelt and placed the stone in the earth. On it, etched carefully by hand, were the words, "No further." It wasn't a warning, it wasn't a curse. It was a mark of boundary, not just territorial, but personal. A statement that what had happened here would not be forgotten, but neither would it define him. This was his line, not one drawn in ink or on maps, but in experience, in choice, in earned resilience. And no one, not a neighbor, not a stranger, not a system, would cross it again without consequence.